Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. If y'all would please take your seats, we're going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Okay, if y'all would take your seats, we're going to get started with our last three speakers. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Patty Spire. Patty is Director of the Seton Cove and Director of Formation for Seton Healthcare Family. Seton Cove is a spirituality center founded 22 years ago and offers people of all faiths the opportunity to nourish and foster their journey towards wholeness through a wide variety of programs and services. Dr. Spire is a spiritual director, teacher, and retreat facilitator who specializes in the use of literature and writing for spiritual growth and ethical development. She's a 2008 doctorate graduate of the Perkins School of Theology and a graduate of the Seminary of the Southwest here in Austin. Patty, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, good morning. I guess it's still morning, yeah. So I'm going to be talking about spiritual intelligence today, and you're maybe wondering what is that. But if you think of emotional intelligence, it's probably the next step up on the pyramid. So we're going to be looking at how the spiritual intelligence help us become more resilient and creative and innovative. And the way I'm going to present this is I'm going to show you what would be ideal, a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that would be ideal to help us with these things, what's wrong now, why we're not at that ideal place, and hopefully some ways to get from what's wrong to what's ideal. So that's what we're going to be doing. Whoops, that's not what I want. Here comes the Savior. What do you want me to do? I want to go back.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. please take your seats. We're going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Okay, if y'all would take your seats, we're going to get started with our last three speakers. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Patty Spire. Patty is Director of the Seton Cove and Director of Formation for Seton Healthcare Family. Seton Cove is a spirituality center founded 22 years ago and offers people of all faiths the opportunity to nourish and foster their journey towards wholeness through a wide variety of programs and services. Dr. Spire is a spiritual director, teacher, and retreat facilitator who specializes in the use of literature and writing for spiritual growth and ethical development. She's a 2008 doctorate graduate of the Perkins School of Theology and a graduate of the Seminary of the Southwest here in Austin. Patty, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, good morning. I guess it's still morning, yeah. So I'm going to be talking about spiritual intelligence today, and you're maybe wondering what is that. But if you think of emotional intelligence, it's probably the next step up on the pyramid. So we're going to be looking at how the spiritual intelligence help us become more resilient and creative and innovative. And the way I'm going to present this is I'm going to show you what would be ideal, a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that would be ideal to help us with these things, what's wrong now, why we're not at that ideal place, and hopefully some ways to get from what's wrong to what's ideal. So that's what we're going to be doing. Okay, so what is right? What is right is the understanding that we're all connected, that we're all one, that we're all part of a whole. Cindy Wigglesworth, who created and did the research for SQ21, or spiritual intelligence, says an innate human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, something we consider to be sacred or noble. That's how she's defining spirituality. So, if you think about this need to be connected to something bigger, it can really be lonely if you're thinking of yourself as separate. If you're the only one who has all these responsibilities and all these things to take care of and do, and you're not part of a community, part of a whole. So Gerald May, who was a psychiatrist, says the most basic and lasting understanding of spirit is that it is the force of being. So it's the animating force within all of us. He says spirit, its nature and source, always mysterious, is the energy that impels our being. It's the same energy that impels the being of all creation. And in it, we can find our relatedness to everyone and everything in the universe. So spirituality is the connecting force for all of us. It's much, much bigger than religion. Religion is just a way of working out your spirituality. Now, what's wrong? Those were the ideals, the film clip, and the sense of being together, being one with each other. That's not really the way we live. So this Buddhist philosopher says, why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you think and everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one. Now, interesting, isn't it? In what sense is there not a self? Well, there's not a separate self. The Buddhists are always talking about how we are empty of a separate self. So we usually think of the separate self as what? Well, in the Christian Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. What kind of life are we talking about here? Losing our life to find our life. It's one of those wonderful paradoxes in spirituality. So the life that Jesus is talking about here and the self that doesn't exist on a permanent basis is our ego-driven self, the self that's consumed with outward forms, the self that is, as Richard Rohr says, constantly accessorizing itself with more and more titles and more goodies, more power, more prestige. That's the self that doesn't really exist. Yes, we have an ego. We need our ego to function and to get across the street without being run down by a car. So there's nothing wrong with that self. It's just not all that we are. So here's another quote about this illusion of separateness. Richard Rohr happens to be a Christian teacher, but this idea that the root of violence is the illusion of separateness can be found in all the major wisdom traditions. So he says the root of violence is the illusion of separation from God, from being itself, from being one with everyone and everything, which was illustrated in the film clip. Now, contemplation or some kind of meditation, which you'll be hearing more about from some of the other speakers, gradually trains you not to make so much of the differences, but to return to who you are, your true self, which is always beyond any nationality, religion, skin color, gender, sexuality, or any other possible labels. Who you are is much deeper and much greater than that. In fact, you finally can see that there are always and only commercial labels that cover the rich product underneath. So we need to be in touch with that rich product, the who we really are, in order to be resilient, in order to be innovative. This is another teacher, Ilia DeLeo. She's a scientist and a theologian. She says, our need to accumulate and possess everything can separate us from other people and the natural world, and we lord it over others through domination and power. We lose our sense of piety and true relatedness. The world becomes not only stripped of its goodness, but relationships are broken because we fail to recognize our dependence on one another, and thus we fail to acknowledge our dependence on God or something bigger than ourselves. This kind of belief that we're not separate, that there's no such thing as a separate self, is not dependent on a belief in God. It's just dependent on a belief in something bigger. So how are we going to get out of our sense of being this separate, ego-driven being that doesn't really exist to that sense of connectedness and oneness? Spiritual intelligence can help us see through the illusions that make us feel that we are separate. And this little diagram is just showing 3 zones of awareness. In the middle would be who you truly are. The outside ring is reality, but the center ring is the problem. Because if you have these 3 zones of awareness, that ring is between reality and your true self. So the outer zone of reality around us, between our outer zone and our inner zone, is the middle zone that is a zone of illusion that trips us up. So what is in that middle zone? Judgments, cynicisms, fears, assumptions, all kinds of things. Everything, including the kitchen sink, is in there. It makes it really hard to see what reality is. So spiritual intelligence can help us dismantle that middle zone. What is spiritual intelligence? This is Cindy's definition: the ability to behave, act in the world with wisdom and compassion, while maintaining inner and outer peace regardless of the situation. That's a pretty tall order. Most of us can act with wisdom and compassion when everything is going right. But when things are not going as well, it's much harder. So spiritual intelligence increases our awareness of our connectedness to others. Cindy's work, she calls it SQ21 because she's identified these 21 skills of spiritual intelligence. And there's a inventory you can take, and you can meet with a coach and talk about these things, but the ones that are in green are the ones I was thinking of about today. So in the first quadrant is self-awareness. Looking at number 5, awareness of ego self and higher self. So just the ability to know there is more to you than just your ego. That's foundational. And then in quadrant 2, universal awareness, awareness of the interconnectedness of life. So like you are not separate from everything else. I mean, we can think of a million ways that that's really important with climate change. It's just one example. Then experience of transcendent oneness. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. Quadrant 3, keeping your higher self in charge, not reacting from your ego. And finally, becoming a wise and effective leader and change agent. Now, this interconnectedness of life, here's a quote from Einstein: a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He or she experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. The striving to free oneself from this delusion is the one true issue of true religion. Now, that's Einstein on interconnectedness of all life. Cindy says, for human beings at the beginning of the 20th century, interconnectedness is no longer a mystical metaphor or romantic idea. It's a reality that we confront daily in very practical manners. And I mentioned, we can see our political scene. And just the climate change is a big thing that we all are responsible for doing our part with. So we're all connected. What I do is going to influence what happens to you. Now, this experience of transcendent oneness is something that sounds like, wow, what's that? But it's really something that psychologists and psychiatrists tell us, and theologians, is happening to us quite a bit, all the time maybe, but we don't remember it because in experiences of transcendent oneness, your ego drops out of the picture. And you can imagine your ego is not happy about that, so it helps you forget about those experiences. This is a quote from the astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and he is describing a transcendent experience that he had. The biggest joy was on the way home in my cockpit window every 2 minutes, the earth, the moon, the sun, and the whole 360-degree panorama of the heavens. And that was a powerful, overwhelming experience. And suddenly I realized that the molecules of my body and the molecules of the spacecraft, the molecules in the body of my partners, were prototyped, manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And that was an overwhelming sense of oneness, of connectedness. It wasn't them and us. It was, that's me. That's all of it. It's one thing. And now it was accompanied by an ecstasy, a sense of, oh my God, wow, yes, an insight, an epiphany. So in these unitive, sometimes called mystical experiences, there's this overwhelming sense of oneness, often happening in nature. He was like probably in the ultimate nature place to have that happen. But, you know, you think of like the Grand Canyon and all these nature pictures that we saw in that film. I bet every single one of you, if you stop for a minute, can think of having had an experience like that. They usually last only a few seconds. As soon as you say, I'm having a unitive experience, it's over because the ego has come back. Lots of times people have these with art, especially like think of going to a concert. It doesn't have to be some kind of symphony. It could be like Lyle Lovett or something. But people often feel really connected when they're together listening to music, listening to a choir. But mainly in nature, although it could be in a coffee shop, could be walking down the hall in the hospital, but it is a sense of our interconnectedness. And it's good to remember that those exist and try to call them up from time to time. So how do we keep our higher self in charge? Cindy says it's all too easy to recognize ego moments in retrospect, but to be able to interrupt them and allow the higher self to take charge before you've acted out of an ego-driven impulse or reaction requires a significant level of mastery. My higher self muscle has been developed by a consistent daily practice for a long time. It's now a habit. She's talking about her meditation practice. And Meredith, you're going to be talking about it. Anna's going to be talking about that later. Dawn, you were talking about the importance of presence, that presence with the patient. And meditation helps us be present, and we're more likely to be aware of our interconnectedness then. A change agent is someone who helps other people, groups, organizations navigate through changes in a way that results in good solutions, faster implementation of change, and less stress and grieving. We all want less stress and grieving, I think. But knowing that we're connected, looking for the solution that is going to affect everybody in a positive way is much more innovative than an ego-driven solution. So let's see, what time is it? Here is a practice that I want to teach you about and actually have you do right now. This is a poem by Mark Nepo. How many of y'all are familiar with Mark Nepo? A few of you are. He had a bestseller on New York Times bestseller list probably about 5 or 6 years ago, his Book of Awakening. He's also a poet. And this is one of his poems. His poems are very simple and very accessible. And this one he says, below our strangeness, my soul tells me we were all broken from the same nameless heart, and everything wakes with a piece of that original heart aching its way into blossom. This is why we know each other below our strangeness, why when we fall, we lift each other, or when in pain, we hold each other, why sudden with joy, we dance together. Life is the many pieces of that great heart loving itself back together. Okay, I'm going to ask somebody else to read that. Brian, will you read it? And when he reads it, will you just take your pen or pencil and underline any word or phrase that stands out for you in that poem?
I got it. My soul tells me we were all broken from the same nameless heart, and everything wakes with a piece of that original heart aching its way into blossom. This is why we know each other below our strangeness, why when we fall, we lift each other, or when in pain, we hold each other, why sudden with joy, we dance together. Life is the many pieces of that great heart loving itself back together.
Okay, so just take like 1 minute to share with the person next to you the word or phrase that stood out for you. Just like maybe 30 seconds. Okay, let's come back. Now, this is an example of a practice that you can do for yourself. You can take any book that inspires you, poetry, scripture, whatever, and just carve out a little time in the day to read something and see what is speaking to you in that. Now, the next part of that practice is to think about how is this piece relevant to my life. So, journaling is a great spiritual practice to increase spiritual intelligence. So right now, you have those questions in your packet. What's the skill or gift that you as a physician possess that helps you lift others, heal, and help others to build relationships and make connections? Because building relationships is so key. All real living is meeting, Martin Buber said. Second question, how have you experienced one of your fellow associates helping you, lifting you, making a connection that accomplished a goal? How did this help you see through your illusion of separateness and become more resilient? Finally, when you drop your illusion of separateness, what new innovative possibilities present themselves to you? So I would invite you now just to choose one of those questions and just kind of do some spontaneous writing. Just take like a minute or two. Just write on the back of that sheet the thoughts that come up for you for one of these questions. Just take like a minute. Okay, I know that's not very much time, but just take a minute now to share with one or two other people around you, as you're comfortable, what you wrote about. If you're not comfortable, then you can just speculate on what you might say about some other question. But just take about a minute to do that. just come back now in the interest of time, just when you're getting going, I know. Come on back. I want to point out that as I'm looking around, I feel terrible interrupting these conversations, but Brian's going to give me the hook in about 2 seconds. So if you can come back and think about how your conversation just chipped away at that illusion of separateness. You know, this brief little conversation, when you are talking about wisdom and compassion, you know, when you're talking about, Dawn was talking about our feelings and emotions, how important that is. I was talking to Dr. Emily Hirsch yesterday, and she told me all of this wellness stuff isn't going to do any good if we're not talking about the heart of medicine. And I said, well, what is the heart of medicine? And she said, it's that deep connection with your colleague, but also mainly with your patient. But if we are, running around on this ego, separateness, circumference of our lives, we're not going to be in that presence that Dawn talked about. So just these little tiny conversations can buoy you up, increase your spiritual and emotional intelligence, and help you know you're not alone. So let me just quickly close up here with these last slides. Dr. Vic Stretcher is a medical researcher at University of Michigan School of Public Health. Studies show that the regular practice of meditation delivers consistent positive effects on our physical and mental well-being. Depending on the specific practice, there are many of them. Meditation can increase energy and willpower, reduce insomnia, improve diet, and enhance creativity. So some kind of meditation practice, it might be walking meditation if you're not somebody who wants to sit still. And I'm going to leave you with the loving kindness meditation challenge. There is a loving kindness meditation in your packet. And some of you have studied Buddhism or are Buddhist. That's the metta, loving kindness meditation from Buddhism. And it's basically saying this about yourself, then about someone you love, then about someone you don't really know that way at all, and finally getting to someone who really kind of bugs you. Now, there's a ton of research, you can Google it, on loving kindness meditation, how it changes people, how it makes them more compassionate and wise. So I'm going to challenge you to try it. The directions, if you need more than just this slide, are in there in your packet. And here are a couple of resources for you, the web addresses for Seton Cove, where you can come to us and we'll give you the spiritual intelligence inventory. And it's a great way to do some coaching, to learn more about yourself. We have meditation classes there that Dr. Anna Vu and David Wallace teach, a lot of those for us. We have meditation groups, and we have quite an innovative leadership program if you're interested in that. Then this other website, contemplativelife.org, there's just like thousands of contemplative practices available on that website. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patty. That was, I'm sure, an easy task to condense an 8-hour workshop into 30 minutes with me staring at you. Nice job. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Meredith Davenport. Meredith practices OB-GYN in a private practice setting in Kyle. She helped create and implement the Provider Associate Care Team, PACT, program, which provides emotional support to Seton providers and associates following significant adverse work-related events. She serves as a regional education team member for TMA Committee on Physician Health and Wellness, is a mindful-based stress reduction teacher, speaker, and retreat facilitator. Meredith, thank you for being here with us.
Can y'all hear me? Okay, great. So again, my name is Meredith Davenport. I work as an OB-GYN both in Austin and in Kyle in 2 different hospital systems. And I am very excited to be here sharing this topic with you. This was something I didn't learn about until about 3 years ago. But I want to take a mindful pause first and just express my gratitude to the Travis County Medical Society and to the team that's created this physician wellness program. It's really innovative and ahead of its time. Although many of us think something like this should have been created a long time ago, I really look forward to see how it unfolds in the coming months and years ahead. So thank you for your time and efforts in creating it. So on my path to try to develop my own and create my own personal resiliency, what I was fortunate enough to do is to stumble upon the practice of mindfulness meditation about a decade ago. And this practice has really sustained me in many different ways through very personal and professional challenges over the ensuing years. And so one of the forms that this has taken for me is a practice of inquiry, or kind of holding a question through my meditation practice or in my day-to-day activities. And the second time I pulled myself out of the dark place of burnout, I kind of looked around and realized that there were many other physician colleagues I had that were in that same space. And so the question that I came up with was, how can we create a culture that supports physician resiliency? And so I carried this question with me as I began to give talks on physician burnout and talk about ways that we can find our own individual strategies for approaching it. I carried this question with me when I started working with medical students at UTMB in Galveston in the physician healer track. I carried the question with me as I started to create physician support groups in Kyle. And then one day I learned about the PACT program. This was back in probably November, December 2014, which was an institutional strategy being developed within Ascension Seton to help support second victims, which is a concept I'd never heard of before. So 2 things occurred to me at that time. One is, if we were going to create a peer support program, what we very much needed is we needed to make sure that people came into those encounters with their presence. And I really wanted to make sure that mindfulness was a strong part of our peer support training. And so for that reason, I jumped in. But then at the same time, it occurred to me that maybe this is the answer to the question I'd been carrying. Maybe if we can walk alongside our physician colleagues in our darkest professional moment and help them tap into resources that they already have inside and be able to help them make sure that they're using those resources that they already have inside and help them find their way back to where they were before, if not in a better place, wouldn't this then help them support their own resiliency? And if we did this often enough, would it then shift the culture? And so with both of these things in mind, I jumped into the program. And I'm so glad that I did. So what I'm going to talk about right now is I'm going to actually describe or define second victim for you. But what I really want to do is I want to describe it. And I want to describe it with the intention that you can recognize whether you've had a second victim experience personally in the past, whether you might have one in the future, so that you can recognize it in your colleagues and the staff that work alongside you, so that maybe you can provide benefit in these situations. I'm going to talk about the PACT program, and time willing, I'm going to talk about a few other strategies that I think may be beneficial if you're at a site where there's not an institutional strategy, or as an accompaniment if you are in a system that has this program. And so the term second victim was initially described by Dr. Albert Wu, and this was in the British Medical Journal in 2000, which is when I was a resident. I never heard of this until, again, 3 or 4 years ago. And what he described was an incident. He was, again, resident at the time in internal medicine. And what he was describing is he was describing an incident where an EKG had been misread by one of the house officers the night. And then in the middle of the night, that same patient was rushed to the operating room with a pericardial tamponade. And what his observation was the following morning, and if you've been in practice even in residency, you're going to recognize that the next day he came in and the story of this case kind of had spread throughout the residency, and people were very harshly judging and criticizing this medical error that this house officer had made. So for one of his questions was, gosh, I wonder if I would have made the same error. But then he started to wonder, what happens to the house officer or any physician in the aftermath of these errors, and why aren't we appropriately addressing this? And so this is when he came up with the term second victim. And so we're very good in medicine, and we should be at taking care of patients, right? That's why we go into medicine. And so when things don't go well, the patient, and then over time we learn how to take care of the patient's family and loved ones that are surrounding them. And so this is all termed first victim. And then the second victim, again, is the healthcare professional, certainly has some impact from these events. And then more recently in the literature, and most of the literature since this article in the British Medical Journal has actually been in the risk management realm, which is why most people haven't heard of this term until more recently. But the third victim is now described as the institution, because what we're learning is when these events happen, which they will, I mean, adverse events are just going to happen, but not only is the person on the front tip, but the whole team is impacted. And if we don't provide support and some sort of strategy, then the institution suffers. And one of the problems I had first with the concept of second victim is I had a hard time owning that, that title. And so if it helps you to use the term secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, I would encourage you to kind of insert that as I'm talking. So the definition of second victim over the course of 10 years, it was kind of revamped and expanded. And this is by Dr. Susan Scott, who's kind of been at the forefront of the research in second victim. She's at the University of Missouri Health System. And so the definition has been expanded to include healthcare team members that are involved in an unanticipated patient event. It can be a medical error and or a patient-related injury, and we become victimized in the sense that we're traumatized by the event. Frequently, the individuals feel personally responsible for the outcome, whether or not a medical error occurs. Many feel as though they've failed the patient. We start to second guess our clinical skills and our knowledge base. And so I think it's quite unrealistic to think, again, we as healthcare professionals who are frontline witnessing human suffering won't be impacted in some way by these events. So the incidence, as they started to look at this, ranges about 15%, and this was looking at all clinicians in this study, but what's significant is that about 15% of people who had second victim experiences were very seriously looking at leaving the profession, which should be noteworthy. This is actually going back to the initial definition, looking at medical errors, and so this is looking at how physicians are emotionally impacted in the aftermath of medical errors. And I won't read all the bullet points, but some of the things that I like to draw out from this study is that even near misses. So I write the prescription, the pharmacist or the nurse calls me and says, hey doc, she's allergic to the medicine you just wrote. They fix it. And again, the error doesn't land on the patient, but yet 33% of the time, many of us as physicians are beating ourselves up. And I think we have a culture of self-criticism. And for many of us, that's been a very useful strategy for many years. And I'm going to touch on something, hopefully, if I get time at the end, that might be an approach to handle this differently. What they also found from this study is that 90% of physicians felt that their healthcare organization did not adequately support them, which is why institutional strategies make sense. And 82% of people reported that they'd be interested in counseling after serious error. These are physicians, so pretty significant. So with ongoing research, what we found is that the unsupported second victim has been associated with an increase in depression, not surprisingly, increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, subsequent adverse events. So you can imagine you run a code, you've done everything exactly right, the patient doesn't make it. We carry that event with us into the next case. And so sometimes we'll be triggered, and even though you're running the code exactly right, we start to hesitate a little bit. And this is why most of the research, again, is in the risk management literature. There's a clear association with the unsupported second victim with an increased risk of burnout, which has implications for how we go home and whether we drink one glass of wine or the whole bottle. Has implications for whether we go home and kick the dog and how we interact with our loved ones at home. And one of the things I would point out to you is I think it's important for our family members and loved ones to actually know about this concept, because many times our family members and loved ones are the first ones who know that things aren't going well. We're really good as physicians at coming to work, putting on that mask, and our whole home life could be falling apart, but we're going to show up to work on time, do a good job, and not really show evidence of what's going on really till we leave the work environment. Burnout also has implications for how we take care of patients, has implications for the environment in which we work, right? How we interact with other people. There's also an association with a decrease in quality of life and empathy. So not every adverse event is actually going to be a second victim experience. These tend to be cases where we care a little bit more. We're more connected to the person that the bad outcome happened to. And so what happens is, at some unconscious, most likely level, we start to think, you know what, I cared so much about that person, it really hurt when things didn't go well. So I'm going to stop caring so much in the next encounter so that if things don't go like I want, maybe it's not going to hurt so bad. So we start to pull back. And for many of us, I think we derive our meaning and our satisfaction from our careers with that connection. But if we're pulling back all the time, then that may be part of what's leading to some of the other things we've talked about today. So as I just alluded to, not every event is going to actually trigger a second victim reaction or experience. So higher risk scenarios, and I'm sharing this with you so that, again, you can recognize this from the events that are happening around you, both for yourself and for your colleagues. So one event many people will be involved in, but obviously everyone's going to have their own experience of this particular event. Some people may get impacted more greatly, other people not so much. So if a patient reminds a staff member of their own family or loved ones, much more likely to be a second victim reaction. Pediatric cases, medical errors, certainly we all show up to work each day wanting to do good, and when we do something that causes harm, it can be devastating. Failure to rescue cases, first death experience. So maybe you work in a place where you've had, just because of the type of patients you take care of, you've had more exposure to death. So someone dies and everyone leaves the room, but you got a brand new RN or a CA standing at the bedside, not really knowing what to do. It means a lot to the staff if we reach out and just pat them on the shoulder and say, hey, let me guide you out, or just say a kind word in that moment. Or if you don't have time, point someone else in that direction. Hey, can you go check on Sally? Long-term patients, unexpected patient demises, multiple patients with bad outcomes. The other thing that's not included on here are actually violence towards providers or violence towards staff cases. Should be included on here. So the University of Missouri Health System was trying to figure out where they should implant peer supporters so that they could optimize the chances that a peer supporter would be present when there was a second victim experience happening. What they learned and what we've learned since then is that these experiences can actually happen anywhere, and it's not just to the people on the front line. Now that we're going to teletranslation, it may be a little bit different, but certainly if you call a translator in and they don't know what they're about to translate, and you're now all of a sudden having a conversation with a loved one that the patient's not going to make it, that person, again, is going to be impacted by that translation. And so maybe a prompt to the person who's translating before you go in the room, if you actually have a human translator rather than teletranslation. The other thing is the clerk who has to go into a room and maybe they see a person that looks just like their Aunt Susie, and now all of a sudden they're going back and they're getting the information in so we can start practicing medicine, right? They can't practice medicine until they're in the computer. And then they put it in and they're just sitting there like a deer in the headlights. That person may be having a second victim experience. So again, checking on people around us. So second victim experiences are incredibly stressful events, and so it's not surprising that there's going to be different ways that everyone experiences this. There's going to be very much a stress reaction cycle, so physiologic reaction to any type of overwhelming stress. Some of us are going to go home and we're not going to be able to sleep. Other people are going to want to sleep all the time. So there's a wide variation in how people will kind of process this. There can be an altered appetite. One person eats everything in sight, the next person isn't eating. So wide array. Then there can be a wide variation in emotional symptoms. And what I would argue is that obviously we're all very unique, and our stress reaction cycles are going to be very, very different from person to person. So the person who, after an adverse event, the doctor who's throwing their cell phone, kicking the wall as they're walking off the unit, that may be someone who's having a second victim reaction. Same thing as the person who's sneaking down the back stairwell to have a moment to cry before they compose themselves and come back up to the unit. So just being aware, and what we train our peer supporters is really just recognizing that just because you think you might respond in a certain way to an event doesn't mean that that's how the person that you're supporting is. So it's just being able to hold the space for whatever arises. Other symptoms people can have are difficulty concentrating. Some people will not want to go into that same room where the event happened. Other people, maybe it's someone who normally goes out and is with friends all the time and now they're not doing anything, or vice versa. So just being aware of people's patterns and recognizing if there's a big shift in some way. And so what we also train our peer supporters, again, these are normal reactions of a normal person to an abnormal event. And our job as peer supporters is really just to hold the space for whatever arises. It's a lot of normalization. So there's this second victim conceptual model that's been developed, again, out of University of Missouri Health System, where there's this unanticipated clinical event, there's a second victim reaction, the clinician recovers however they recover. This is the traditional model. And then there's three potential outcomes that have been described based on research. One is dropping out. So again, that 15% of people who are seriously looking at leaving the profession, it could be as simple as changing hospitals where you work or clinics where you work. And then obviously the most severe consequences are, and there's certainly stories in the literature of people who've taken their own lives and committed suicide after these events. Many times when I read these stories, it sounds as if the person who was involved was very isolated in the aftermath of the event. There are some people who end up just kind of surviving after these events. So these are people who start to pull on some of their coping strategies. They can't quite see the big picture. They're the person who used to come in bright-eyed, bushy-tailed to work each day, and now they're just kind of showing up and they're just going through the motions. So they're there, but the light's kind of out. And then there are some people who take these events and they actually kind of turn them upside down. They really start to get involved in the systems issues and trying to make sure this, whatever the event was doesn't happen to someone else. And these are people who can see big picture. They have good coping mechanisms and they're relying on them. They're getting the support that they need. And so one of the questions I have is, and this is a quote by Ernest Hemingway, the world breaks everyone and afterward many are strong at their broken places. So how do we create a system where we can kind of push more people and guide them towards thriving so that there really is a strength in the aftermath of these events? And so this is where the approach at the institutional level comes in. And so this is, what I'm going to describe to you is the three-tiered model that comes from the University of Missouri Health System, and this is what we modeled our PACT program after. And so they have a 4U program that they developed. About 10% of hospitals, systems, and healthcare organizations actually have second victim programs at this point in time. So Tier 1 support is really what I'm providing to you right now. Education. Sometimes knowledge is power, this awareness that, hey, this case was really difficult and I'm having a hard time, but you just need to know, hey, I'm going to get past this, and it's not totally, you don't necessarily need a higher level of support. So this is estimated about 60% of people would need the Tier 1 support, just general education. Tier 2 is where we actually have trained peer supporters that go in and one-on-one support the person who's been impacted by providing just some space for them to vent and to open up and to be able to kind of process what the event was. And it's estimated that about 30 to 40% of people will actually need this level of support. And then there's a tier 3, which is estimated to cover about 5 to 10%. We found much less in our PACT program. But this is to identify people who need ongoing support that's beyond the level of the trained peer supporter. So these are people who maybe were already in burnout or already having problems at home in their personal life, and then this big event happened. And it's just enough to push them kind of over the edge where they really need some ongoing support. So in the tier 3, there's an expedited referral to employee assistance program. There's chaplaincy, social work, and other resources are brought in to help. And so now the second victim conceptual model has kind of shifted from what I showed you before. And now the idea is there's this second victim reaction, and now the institution steps in and helps guide the clinician to recovery and hopefully guiding more people to surviving and thriving rather than allowing them to be isolated and potentially dropping out. So our provider associate care team, again, was developed within Ascension Seton, and we mirrored a lot of what the University of Missouri Health System's 4U program had created. And so what PACT is it's an accessible and standardized program for providers and associates to receive emotional support immediately following a significant work-related event. So we provide help for the second victim. It's immediate peer-to-peer support. Ideally, we support the person in need before they go home from their shift. We have trained peer supporters that have gone through an 8-hour training in mindful presence and being aware of how to identify second victims, as well as kind of how to help guide an encounter, and how to help identify the people who may need additional resources. We're available 24/7. There's a confidentiality aspect. And the idea is that it's a very proactive approach, that you know that this event happened and you're checking on them immediately, rather than waiting the weeks and months later where there's then some impact on their career and how they're practicing or their personal lives. And so the way the program was initially brought out is through this kind of process, and I'll go into how it shifted. But essentially, there's a second victim event that a second victim is recognized. So this adverse event happens, someone is identified that needs support. And in one form, what happens is if there's a PACT peer supporter on the unit, they automatically reach out and provide support to that person. If there's not a known peer supporter that is nearby, then what happens is we dial 0 and we get a PACT site team lead who helps us identify who the peer supporter is that's in-house. And then that peer supporter is sent out. They do one-on-one support. And then we also kind of make an agreement, if it's acceptable to the person that we're supporting, to meet with them again in 48 to 72 hours. And the idea is that during that first meeting, you're helping them kind of identify, what's helped you before with difficult situations. And you kind of make a plan. And that follow-up visit is really to make sure that the person is using that plan and they're actually moving in a good direction, as opposed to if they're really struggling at that point in time, that's someone that you would refer on to Tier 3 resources. And the reason I say that this is initially how the program rolled out, what we find more often now that it's been out for a little over, well, almost 2 years at this point, is that many times what happens is an event has happened and the site lead comes in the next day and someone's already been supported. So a lot of stuff is actually happening on the ground level, and it doesn't necessarily go through this formal process, which is what we were hoping was going to happen. So we rolled out initially in November of 2015, and all through last year we rolled out at all of the Ascension Seton hospitals. As of September of this year, we have 442 trained peer supporters, 47 providers, and this includes residents, physicians, includes nurse practitioners and PAs. There's been 571 individual encounters. Over 57 providers have received support, and the reason that I know it's more than that is because we didn't start, following that data until later in the process. And the new thing that we rolled out kind of in the middle to the end of last year is we started providing group encounter support. So we have actually someone who's trained in crisis intervention stress management that goes in, and so if there's a big event, again, rarely is it going to be something that just impacts one person. A whole unit can be impacted, and so we try to arrange 48 to 72 hours afterwards a time where the whole group can come back in if they choose to do so, and there's the crisis intervention stress management facilitator to help facilitate the dialogue. We use our peer supporters, 1 or 2 in these events, as lifeguards, and their job is really to help identify people who might need one-on-one support after the group interaction, and or so that there's someone for people to go to in the aftermath of the group debrief if they want additional support. And so in 2016, the program won an Ascension Mission and Values Award for the institutional strategy that most supported the mission and values of Ascension. And at the bottom, I have a link. It's like a 5-minute video that they put together that really speaks to what the program does. It's very well done. And so now I'm going to break off into another small area that I think is equally important. And this is for those of you who don't have an institutional program where you work. I think these can be strategies that are useful even if you do have an institutional strategy, something to help support ourselves in the aftermath of these events. And so the Dalai Lama says, "Be kind whenever possible. It is always possible." And one thing I would say to all the physicians in the room, even to ourselves. And so there's some lovely work from Kristen Neff, who's here at UT in Austin, who was a pioneer in the work on self-compassion. Self-compassion is a skill that you can learn. One of the ways you get there is actually from loving kindness meditation is one pathway, which Patty alluded to earlier. And several places where self-compassion has been brought in. One is the Dell Children's Resiliency Center is doing some grant work with Kristen Neff, where they're actually working with pediatric residents to try to teach these skills, and they're actually studying them. And then we've also used it for our medical students in the physician healer track at UTMB in Galveston, and it's been a powerful gift to them. And I would say for myself as well, who is pretty high on the self-criticism pathway before encountering this practice. So there's 3 elements of self-compassion. And I'm going to use this in the backdrop of maybe an adverse event has just happened. So you get the patient wherever they need to go, they're stabilized, and now I have a moment to actually check in with myself. So there's a component of mindfulness, which means that I actually check in with myself and recognize, you know, I'm feeling bad, having a hard time right now. I recognize that I'm suffering. Number 2 is an awareness of common humanity, and that's the recognition that we all have moments of suffering, moments of difficulty in our lives. It takes us out of isolation by recognizing common humanity. The last part is the part that's new for many of us who are good with self-criticism. The last part is bringing self-kindness. So really even just a touch to oneself over the heart of, okay, this is hard and I'm going to get through it. You can come up with a phrase, a kind word, really becoming aware of the language that we're talking to ourselves, not like a schizophrenic, but talking to ourselves in the aftermath of these events. And again, it's a skill that we can learn to bring self-kindness rather than self-criticism in these moments. And what her research has shown, which I think holds promise for a second victim experience, is that people who score higher in self-kindness actually have improved well-being, so decreased rumination, playing the event over and over again, decrease in perfectionism and shame, which are rampant in our profession. There is an increase in motivation, so we're much more likely to take a difficult experience and actually want to learn and grow in the aftermath of that experience. There's an increase in personal accountability, so maybe there was a medical error. With self-kindness, I may be more likely to be able to recognize that and really talk about it. Improvements in coping and resiliency, healthy behaviors rather than the bottle of wine, and then an increase in concern for others. So I would encourage you to consider exploring it. I included a YouTube video by Kristen Neff where she talks about this. And then the next thing is, how do we take care of one another as a profession? And then John Christensen, when describing second victim, describes it as a journey into a place of shame, fear, and isolation. And so the way that we get out of this space is we share our stories with others. We touch base, we connect. And so what I would say to you is that I hereby empower everyone in this room. Check in with your colleague. You don't have to be trained as a peer supporter. I guarantee that as a physician, you have the ability to offer a healing presence. Not a, I'm going to fix you, but just I'm going to check in with you. So frequently on my phone call dialogues, it's, hey, I heard you had a rough day. Do you want to talk about it? And maybe they do, and you're in the middle of 12 other things, and you say, hey, you know, right now I really want to give you my full attention, so how about can we meet, you know, later at the end of the day? Can we meet at 5 and grab a cup of coffee, and let's go talk? But that sense of connection, that recognition that, hey, I heard about this and I want to know how you're doing, goes a long way. Again, offering that healing presence. For people who know that they want some sort of other support, there's actually an entity called Medically Induced Trauma Support Services, and they provide support to both family members who've been impacted by traumatic events, as well as to physicians and clinicians. And you can actually get anonymous and confidential peer support by going through their system. And then I'm just going to flip through this real quickly, but as a leader, for those of you who are physician leaders, possible department leader responses are listed here. It's all about connection, keeping people in the loop, not leaving them isolated. And then going back to my original inquiry question, I want to share a couple of examples with you about my own experience as a peer supporter within the program. So kind of more than once what has happened is I've reached out to a physician that doesn't even want support. Hey, I heard you had a rough day. Do you want to talk about it? No, I'm good, actually. Thanks. I've had multiple times where the physician then pauses and says, you know what, I've been in practice 15 years. I've been in practice 8 years. No one's ever checked on me in the aftermath of a difficult event, and I really appreciate that you reached out and did that. It made a difference. And I think, so that's one story. The other story happened more recently, and there was a big event, and the person actually requested PACT peer support, but didn't want to have support the same day as the event, wanted to go home and take a break. So then we unfortunately played phone tag over the next couple of days for various reasons. And then once I made contact with this person, what she told me is she said, you know what, I wanted PACT peer support, but what's happened in the last 2 days is that my colleagues have reached out and have checked on me, and I feel like I'm good right now. So thank you very much. I'll reach out to you again if I need help. And I thought, you know what, this is hopefully the beginning of our culture shift. And I'm hoping that as it continues to unfold, that this really is one of the first steps in the direction to the answer of my question. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. That's just fantastic work. Okay, our last speaker today, and again, we'll have time for questions and answers or comments after we finish our last presentation. Dr. Anna Vu. Anna serves as on the St. David's Ethics Committee, our Physician Wellness Program Steering Committee, and is founder and director of the Mindfulness Meditation Clinic at Seton Cove. Dr. Vu conducts quarterly mindful meditation workshop retreats for healthcare professionals, and the next one is coming up in January. There's details about that on the Seton Cove website and also on our Medical Society website about details and links to enroll in that program. So, Anna, thank you.
Hello, everybody. You might be wondering, how does one get the title internal medicine physician - meditator? Well, let me tell you, it was not part of my medical school curriculum. In fact, I graduated in 1994, but I was supposed to graduate in 1992. I spent 2 years in research in the biochemical department studying molecular genetics because I had this intense need for research in evidence-based medicine. So in 1997, 3 years after I graduated, I completed my internal medicine boards. And within 2 years of practice, I was burnt out. Had all the symptoms that was described earlier by my colleagues up here. Now, the word meditation was never in my dictionary at that point. In fact, the word meditation kind of conjure up emotions that is similar to when a patient comes into your office and at the end of the visit said, oh, by the way, I was on the internet and I found at least 400 pages of the internet that has to do with me, and I would like for you to review them. Yes, that nauseous of a reaction. So, burnt out and really didn't know how to help myself. I was in private practice at the time, had my own office in Kansas, and decided, well, there's one way to cure my burnout, and came up with a fabulous solution. What I thought was a fabulous solution. I was going to go into hospital medicine. I didn't say it was smart. It seemed like a good idea at the time because in my mind I was picturing me telling the patient, a very annoying patient, or let me just rephrase that, a challenging patient, to go home and follow up with your primary care doctor. I just couldn't. So I moved down here to Austin, practiced over the next several years, and really percolated and smoldered and burned out, but had no idea at the time. I just was doing what I was told. And many of you are, I know, the same. We just put our nose to the grind and we do our work and we don't complain. We didn't know the impact it had on this person, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And we carry it into our relationships. And that's what happens. But nothing seemed to stop this one from getting help. Well, in 2009, something did happen. The man that I was in my life at the time, the man that I loved with all my heart, hung himself and ended his life. I went on that edge, that smoldering edge, down to an abyss, and I couldn't get my face up to even look at any person in the eye. But yet, I continued to practice, avoiding any kind of connection with people. Where I didn't realize that event brought so much pain to the surface. I didn't realize that it was physical pain. It's indescribable. It was with me every moment, every waking moment. And there was nothing I could do. I tried everything. Colleagues have offered to treat me. Finally, one day, someone said, "Why don't you try meditation?" And I thought, oh, kill me now. You know, I'm already in the abyss. Might as well go into crazy. So, despite being skeptical, I tried it. And I have to tell you, I remember that moment. It's about my second or third week into a very intense meditation training. I opened my eyes, and the physical pain was gone. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that something so simple could do this, and it wasn't a pill. So, over the next 2 to 3 months, something else happened. I noticed joy. I noticed that I want to go into a patient's room. I look forward to it. I look forward to being in connection with that patient, no matter where they are. I wanted that relationship, and I couldn't wait to serve. And I enjoyed hospital medicine despite all the challenges. And I thought, gosh, if this can happen, I wonder what's happening to this body. What's happening here? What's happening here? And as I looked around at my colleagues, I can only see, out of hundreds of physicians that I interact with, I can only see a handful of us who shared with me in that joy. And I started to look a little bit more into physicians and statistics about physicians. I'm not going to go into too much detail. And by the way, one of the stress that I had this week was, I thought that I was supposed to give an hour and 30-minute talk. Dr. Sayer sent me an email 3-4 days ago and said, oh, try to crunch it in 30 minutes. So I'm going to do my best. Let's see. There we go. So you all know the statistics. I'm just going to go through this very quickly with you. Approximately 400 physicians commit suicide each year, and this was reported by the CDC. And what's so interesting, as Brian already said earlier, is that female physicians, are 3 times more likely than their male colleagues. Young physicians at the beginning of the training are particularly vulnerable. In a recent study, 9.4% of fourth-year medical students and interns reporting having suicide thoughts in the previous 2 weeks, and as many as 21.2% of medical students suffer from depression. The latest, I'm going to skip this one actually, because there's another one that is really interesting. This would be it. So, a friend of mine, Dr. Don Counts, I think some of you may know who he is, gave me this very interesting article from the New York Times published in January 16, 2016. He noted that healthcare has becoming increasingly subjected to metrics and measurements. I think some of my colleagues have already said that. But the focus has gone too far. While more than 1,600 medical centers claim to be, top 100 You see them when you walk in the hospital, honor roll, grade A, or best hospital list due to these measurements. Well, burnout rates for physicians top 50%. And in another 213 study found that electronic health record was the dominant culprit. And I think that you guys can identify. So what Andy Slavitt, Medicare acting administrator at the time, said, we have to get hearts and minds of physicians back, and I think we've lost them. I'm going to skip a few statistics here. Sorry, didn't have time to, and I know that we talked about all of these symptoms of burnouts, and they are in the handouts. And I think Brian has already alluded to some of this, but I wanted to kind of review a little bit about stress and its consequences with you, because I think it's very important to understand in our body what's happening. I know this is a very stressful diagram. Bear with me. We'll make it less stressful. So the stress response, if you focus on the side that says stress response, triggers a cascade of physiological responses. These include increased oxygen consumption and respiration, increased blood pressure caused by increased cardiac output, and increased total peripheral resistance. It also triggers an increased blood flow to the skin, splenic region, muscles, heart. Together, these physiologic responses produce a coordinated series of changes that enable the body to respond to stressful stimuli by providing energy to the area that needed the most. This is what we call the fight or flight response. Now, in a similar manner, look to the other side, a coordinated set of reproducible physiological changes have been observed during the elicitation of the relaxation response. The relaxation response is a physiologic response, and that's been studied for over 30 years by Dr. Herbert Benson. And these includes reductions in oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide elimination, slowing of the heart and respiration rates, and a drop in systolic and diastolic pressure, and increase in heart rate variability. And there are many ways to elicit the relaxation response, which I'll discuss later. So there are two main pathways you can see activated by the stress response. Just a reminder, I am not pronouncing right, the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis and the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Both axes are activated by the hypothalamus cortical releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary gland to release ACTH. In the sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, which is the faster pathway, ACTH stimulates the adrenal medulla to release catecholamines like epinephrine or norepinephrine, which then increases blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, oxygen consumption. The slower axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, when stimulated by ACTH, acts on the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Cortisol then induces the metabolic changes to the liver, resulting in increased glucose in the blood and tissues, which then produces ATP to repair damaged cells and allow metabolically active cells throughout the body to respond to the stressors. So there are disease consequences, as you already see. Between 60 to 90% of healthcare visits are due to stress-induced conditions, and this above. So what are the role of meditation in the stress response? I'm just going to give you a little brief video to watch, and hopefully we can, I think I need help. I skipped the video. There it is.
Dr. Herbert Benson has spent 30 years traveling the globe, studying the world's most accomplished meditators. Using modern technology, Benson is trying to understand how meditation theories reverse the body's natural stress response.
What
we are finding is that for centuries upon centuries, people have discovered that there's something they can do to counteract the harmful effects of stress. Benson named it the relaxation response. It's the body's innate ability to lower blood pressure, reduce heart rate, and slow healing. We are fortunate that we have within us a response opposite to the fight or flight response. That is the relaxation response. And there are scores of techniques, but in all of them, 2 steps are needed. The first is a repetition, a word, a sound, a movement. The second is freeing your mind of thought by concentrating on that repetition. And everyone can do it. The relaxation response can be triggered by all kinds of activity, from the repetition of a prayer to the primal beat of dancing. Even rhythm exercise can reverse the harmful effects of stress. So how does it work? At an MRI facility in Boston, Herbert Benson's colleague, Sarah Lazar, is looking inside the brain for an answer. Her subject is a Tai Chi master, Ramel Robles. He has over 20 years of meditation experience. Ramel has been fitted with equipment to monitor the body temperature and breathing.
We're going to do the meditation stand now. So you're going to lie there quietly for 2 minutes, and then you're going to begin the meditation.
As Ramel begins his meditation, the MRI scanner takes a series of snapshots inside his brain. Over the next 10 minutes, Ramel will try to empty his mind of thought. As Ramel meditates, his breathing slows to 4 breaths a minute, and his body temperature drops. Inside his brain, activity also slows down, but incredibly, the MRI scan reveals that certain areas have become more active. The red spots show activity, as well as controlling our heart and breathing. These are the parts of the brain that control alertness, decision-making, and emotion. It suggests that in the state of meditation, the mind is not only more alert, but that we are able to control our emotional response to stressful situations. Jim Meadows is part of a growing band using these ancient techniques to deal with the demands of the modern world. For 3 years, she has been meditating daily to promote the relaxation response and reduce stress levels.
Learn transcendent meditation is one of the few things I've ever done online. It makes a huge difference to me on a health basis. I've seen the difference in the way in which I work. You have that much more focus and clarity. You could achieve the same results with less effort. I stopped working weekends and evenings and started to get to the life. So for me, it's the best thing I've ever done.
In a world where stress can consume us for prejudice, managing its harmful effects is critical to safeguarding our mental and physical health.
So just to breeze through a little bit, because in interest of time here, just several studies that I'm going to really quickly go through, and you can see and read it, the studies if you like, as I try to put in the reference in here. Basically, studies have shown consistently that cortisol concentration is reduced in meditation, and that has been quite significant. I'm going to skip over nitric oxide a little bit and go directly to some of the studies that Dr. Herbert Benson and Dr. Dusick at the University of Massachusetts and Harvard did. What they found is that the relaxation response does exhibit distinct physiological patterns: decreased oxygen consumption, increased exhaled nitric oxide, and reduced physiologic states. Relaxation response in hypertension. The studies done here showed that systolic blood pressure is decreased by 9.4 millimercury. Pulse pressure is decreased by 7.9 millimercury on the average, and with that's with just 8 weeks of relaxation response training. But with 16 weeks total of relaxation response training, 32% of study participants were able to eliminate one or more of their antihypertensive. And this was, again, done by Dusick and Benson. Again, as you've seen on the video, stress reduction correlates with structural changes in the amygdala. If you remember, the amygdala is the area in our brain that seems to want to grow when we're under stressful situation. And what they study is, this study shows, based on MRI findings, that with relaxation response, there is reduction in the activity of the amygdala. There's also has been reviewed on MRI by a different researcher that there is increase in cortical thickness. Why is this important? It's important because we're looking at prefrontal cortical thickness, which was really profound or pronounced in older participants, suggesting that this may offset dementia. Okay. The studies that I was going to show you today also look at gene expression changes when you do meditate. And what they showed is that in long-term or short-term meditation, the gene expressions are very similar. So you don't have to be a long-term practitioner in order to have these changes occurring in your body. And the changes usually is cellular metabolism, oxidative phosphorylation, generation of reactive oxygen species, and response to oxidative stress. Techniques utilized in elicitation of the relaxation response: mindfulness meditation. This is the one that I'm most familiar with, but there are many others listed here. I'm trying to cut this short because I really want to give you a little exercise in meditation today to show you what meditation is. A lot of people don't understand the word meditation or what does it exactly mean. Mindfulness meditation, I practice the centering method. It is basically defined as a non-judgmental awareness of the present moment experience. What the hell does that mean? It means it's just a simple method for assisting you to return to the present moment, not fixating on the past or in the future. And it facilitates a non-attachment to thoughts, emotion, physical sensations. It's not about making the mind blank. As long as you're alive, you're going to have thoughts. But these exercises help you build a muscle, so to speak, as many of my colleagues already alluded to step away from those thoughts and not let it affect you. So it creates a space from thoughts evoking emotions or sensation. It's definitely not a clearing of the mind or making the mind blank, but to be aware of your thoughts and having a tool to step back from those thoughts. And it diminishes our reactivity, and it allows for you to respond appropriately instead. So some misconception, it's a religious thing. No, it's pretty much for everyone. The result is completing a clearing of the mind. I think we just said that. You have to sit in a pretzel position. No, not unless you really want to. It's only for hippies or people who hug trees. That was my conception of it. Meditation practice in medicine. This is what we're trying to target as far as our patient meditation clinic that we have initiated at Seton Cove, and hopefully you'll have some handouts on when our next meditation clinic is. So it's adopted in the military, in corporate businesses, in schools, especially with ADD, and even in sports. I can't find a better picture for doctors in meditation. This is so sad. So I would love to go through just a couple minutes and showing you how it's done. If you wouldn't mind making sure your phone is turned off to silence so you don't interrupt the experience for your neighbor. I'd like for you to drop your pen, pencil, whatever you're holding. I would like for you to close your eyes. I will guide you through this short meditation. With eyes closed, your hands comfortable wherever they are, resting, your feet firmly on the ground. Take a deep breath in and let it out. Take a moment and notice your feet on the floor. Notice the pressure of your feet on the floor. Make certain that your back is straight and your posture is relaxed. Notice your shoulders. If you're holding them tensely, relax. Notice your weight in your chair. Notice the muscles of your face. Relax your cheekbones, your cheek muscles, your jaw. Notice where your tongue is in your mouth. Notice the area around your heart. Take another deep breath in and another breath out. Say in your mind the word one. Repeat the word one. 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 Now say the word one 3 more times and sit in silence. When you find that you are back in your thoughts, go back to the word one 3 times. Sit back in silence. Take a gentle breath. And when you are ready, you may open your eyes. So the key is not to make your mind blank. Meditation is the process which we pull away from thoughts using either a word or just observing our breath. We do it 20 minutes, twice a day, is what research shows that helps us to change, to build that muscle for resilience, to build that space that allow for us to take a breath and respond rather than react. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. That's, let's see, I have altered the amygdala gray matter density by making you do this in 30 minutes, I think. Anyway, thank you. That's just a little sampling of what her workshop is like, and again, encourage everybody to spend some time doing that. I wanted to take some time to see if anybody had any comments or questions. If you're pressed for time and need to leave, if you could just sort of do so quietly so that we can work on questions and comments. Be sure and leave your CME form at the desk. If you have a donation form, give it to Belinda or Leanne. And let's see, any questions or comments?
Thank you.
Well, we made quick. Oh, go ahead. Here, you pass it.
A difficult time. I'm sorry. So, I've been meditating for a while, and I guess I struggle with sort of. I know you gave an example, but kind of where should your brain be? You always get invaded by these thoughts that keep coming to you. You sort of get focusing, but I guess could you explain it a little more in depth, the process?
That's great. I can now talk about the workshop a little bit. A little plug for the workshop. This is what we do. During the workshop, we try to help you about the pitfalls of being in silence, not knowing where to go. I think as humans, we forgot to be human being. Instead, we're constantly human doing. And meditation is just that, it's just to be. And you're wondering, where are you? Where are you when you're in this supposed silence? You just are. And I know that sounds so vague, but as you increase your meditation experience, you'll understand that there was nothing. There you are. You're just be. So the word to pull you back into thy silence and letting it go, you become just an observer, almost, and then until you're back into thoughts again. Does that make any sense? You're just an observer.
Time just seems to fly by. You'll have a timer and just. You can't believe it's kind of gone off. One last thing, what is your take on these prolonged silent meditations, a day, a week? I had a student, I teach UTMB students, who they did 1 month silent meditation, which sounds, I go psychotic, but what's your take on them?
I personally feel that you need a silent meditation. At least once a year. I do it, my husband and I do it once a year, whether it's a 5-day or a 10-day silent meditation. A lot of folks here, I don't think have the time to do like a month long, but it really does nourish us the body. I think some of our speakers may speak to that as well. Patty particularly, I think Patty does hold retreats, and you can find that out at setoncove.net. That was good, wasn't it? It's just a right roll in. And but it does help because when you are in silent, and I talk so much, I thought, oh my God, the first time I went into a silent retreat, I thought, I'm never going to be able to shut up. People are going to kick me out. But it was so relieving not being able to talk because all of a sudden the personality, everything, defenses of who I think that I was disappeared. And I became an observer. I became the meditation experience during the entire time. Does that make any sense? And it does help to release a lot of responsibilities that your mind creates during that silence space.
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you all very much for coming, and please support the program.